Everyone, and happy Thursday. Welcome to another episode of Crypto with English. I think as far as the way Web3, blockchain, and all the related subject matter has been transforming, one of the defining characteristics and really the cornerstone, you can almost say the foundation, if you will, of this house is essentially the startup. What makes a startup successful? And I think there are some universal, you could almost say fundamental principles and practices that work in almost any context, regardless of industry. And having the right combination of these things is absolutely crucial, especially in those beginning stages. So I'd like to introduce to you all today a very special guest, Lenore Kantor. She's the president and chief growth officer of Growth Warrior. Her practice specializes in calibrating, troubleshooting, mentoring, and you could say empowering startups to stay on the right course and correct course, if need be, along that path. So, Lenore, thank you very much for coming on today.
Thanks, Adam. Great to be here.
So, can you talk a little bit about your practice and how you started in this space, and some of the patterns that you've come across, in
Sure.
your you could say in your journey so far.
Great. Well, my early career, 2 decades in the traditional financial services establishment, working for a number of trading companies. I worked for an options exchange. I worked in the foreign exchange markets, and for a short stint in the wealth management business, investment bank. So I have a lot of background working in financial services, but specifically I have a lot of expertise with growth startups, so helping to scale businesses. I've been through mergers and acquisitions. I helped to take a company public. 6 months later, they were acquired by. So I've seen what works and I've seen what hasn't worked. For the last 9 years, I've had my own business, Growth Warrior, where I founders and leaders, in addition to organizations. I act in a number of capacities. So I would say my sweet spot is mission, message, market, and then making it happen. So I do a lot with go-to-market, making sure that companies find the right product market fit, helping businesses to enter new markets, client segments, to reposition their businesses properly, and what are all the strategies they need to have in place to scale effectively. And some of the biggest challenges that I see early stage is they're not clear on what it is are trying to accomplish, able to communicate it, even if they know it is. And then sometimes they don't have the right team in place to make it happen. And I guess finally, even if they have moments, sometimes they're just not able to execute the right way because maybe they don't understand the marketplace that they're going after. So there are a number of different elements that need to come into play to help successful, because I've seen many situations where you have two businesses with product and one makes it to the finish line and one kind of and never gets the traction. So I think it's kind of like grandma's secret recipe. Like you gotta have the right ingredients for it to be delicious. Otherwise it's kind of disappointing.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. And let's say if we were to start at the top with the mission, and which I think you've essentially explained essentially a series of these M's, more or less, you have to kind of get right. So starting off with mission, I think there's something, and I'm not alone here. I think there's something almost very exciting and romantic about the whole startup journey. But I think to be realistic, you have to have a lot of variables, or you can say a lot of attributes correct. especially in those beginning stages. So for you, when you're you could say when you're coaching, when you're training, when you're consulting with these various, startup companies, how do you have that conversation where you effectively have to tell them your mission doesn't make sense or your mission is not very clear? Like how does that dialogue, what's your strategy to, kind of you know um get that going?
Yeah, so I think companies struggle in a few places with mission. So sometimes they've got a really big vision. They want to change the world, right?
Right.
That's beautiful, but it's kind of hard to start with that. That's like trying to boil the ocean.
That's a good way of putting it.
So when you're like, revolutionary disruption, whatever that is, that's great, but start with one thing. So I think what sometimes happens is businesses get too broad. They're not clear enough on what is the problem they're trying to solve for a specific set of customers. Right.
Right.
So maybe they get enamored with a technology and they think they have a solution, but maybe it's really just a product and not like really a business. So sort of trying to understand what is it that they're really here to accomplish that's going to solve a significant problem that some client has that they're going to pay them for. So if clients already have a solution and they don't need something different, then you're kind of in this battle of having to prove to them why you're better, right? So it needs
Right.
to be something that they actually need because it's a pain point.
Right, right. And when kind of unpacking some of that, when you have to essentially go to, let's say, one of these co-founders, and their vision is essentially akin to, like you said, boiling the ocean. I think that's a great analogy. What is the general, you could say, reflex type, reaction? Because I would imagine a lot of times, and this is even from my anecdotal experience, sometimes it's kind of like you know you're kind of missing the forest for the trees, or this is
Yeah.
something my professor used to always say. And it seems like, I think maybe you're too close to the idea. We don't really see everything else around it.
Yeah, I guess gets to another issue, which is, the team and the leadership and all of that. So I think that the most successful founders need to be able to remove their ego from what they're trying to accomplish with their business.
Right.
So when you become too attached to your idea that you think that's the answer, then you're not really increasing your chances of success because you might have a brilliant idea, but
Right.
until you find someone who needs it or whose problem you're solving with it,
Right.
it's really just an interesting concept or a product in search of a market. So I think that's where, hopefully the founder realizes I want to build a sustainable business. So to build an
Right.
actual business, I need to really find who are the customers that want the service or product or technology or solution or whatever it is that I have that I can really scale and grow in service of them, right?
Right.
Why is marketing important? Because
Right.
you're looking for your market. You have to search for your customer. Otherwise, you're just, someone who's like super smart and has good ideas. That's
Right.
great. But that doesn't build a business.
Right. And this question is kind of a little bit more, you could say, almost, esoteric, or maybe even philosophical, but pertinent nevertheless. It seems to me, if the idea or the goal is a little bit too broad, especially at the beginning, could that lead to, you could say, burnout? Could that lead to, mismanagement of energy and resources? Because my feeling is this: if the goal is too big at the outset, then it doesn't seem that the objectives are digestible for the actual team members going about it.
Yeah.
So it's not like,
Yeah.
okay, I have to build a sales channel, so to say. No, it's like, okay, we're going to boil the ocean. So let's get working on this. I feel like at some point it becomes counterproductive because I think there's not a clear metric as far as
Yeah.
either, you could say pacing yourself or even judging what success is as you're, moving about this.
How do I say this? Some of it's chicken and egg, right? Like on the one hand, you want to find your first client. So then when you get that client, you kind of have a tendency to be like, well, this is our segment. And that may be true, but just because there's one audience that is interested in what you're doing doesn't mean that every other audience will also be interested. And so when you start to go after multiple client segments, what happens is you dilute the effectiveness of what you're doing because your message may not be clear. The needs of each audience may be different. So you may not really be addressing what it is each of them needs. And it becomes sort of difficult to prove the value of what you've developed because you're not really understanding the end customer needs like in a focused sort of way. So I think it can be challenging when you are spreading yourself too thin to really get the traction that you want. Because let's say you go to beta, you have your user group, but you've got 3 different types of businesses. They may not need the same thing. So it's going to be difficult to decide which are the product features we need to prioritize. So it just sort of has this knock-on effect. So the more clear you can be about your audience and the value to them, getting those users, getting the feedback, it becomes sort of like a virtuous circle. It feeds upon itself and helps you to kind of grow and expand.
Right. And, you mentioned a very good point, and you said this in a very brief sentence: a product looking for a market. I hear that. That sounds like a very difficult thing versus, let's say, and I think you touched on this already, essentially finding a need in the market and then perhaps creating a product around
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
so to say.
Yeah. Well, listen, I think there are 2 different approaches, and it really depends on often the founder's background. So when you have technology founders, they might develop some technology so they become enamored with the technology itself. And then they realize, oh, we got to find the right people who need this. Right. So I've seen that happen with software shops. They develop something, it's useful for them. And then they think, oh, everyone else probably needs this too. So let me go out and sell it. And sometimes that's true. Others may benefit from what you've developed. But more impactful is when you really identify that a market segment is having a challenge, and then you develop the solution for their challenge in order to address the problem in a way that's different than anyone else in the market, because that's going to give you a distinct competitive advantage.
Right. Very well said. And one of the other M's you've mentioned too, making it happen. So what comes to mind, well, when I hear that, is the funding, the capital, the money behind these, projects. You know, uh, I think something like 9 out of 10 startups fail. That's just the
Yeah.
practical, reality of it. So I was wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about, some of your experience where, let's say, uh, the capital, the money was not in sync with the practical and just long-term goals. I think it's great to have very great ambitious dreams and drive, but there are some anchors we can't ignore, as
Yeah.
as one is going about this.
Yeah, this is the money issue is always a tricky one. So, on the one hand, you need to be able to either have such an innovative, game changing solution that, VC, private equity, whoever the early investors are, throw money at you because you've got a proven team
Right,
and they believe you're going to be able to execute. Unfortunately, that's the rare exception, right? Those are the ones that have a higher likelihood of success.
right,
But um, companies that are bootstrapping, first of all, you want to get proof of market. So you want to find customers to test your product and give you income as quickly as possible. But
right,
let's just say you manage to get some funding. The realistic timeline is 18 months of capital is needed in terms of
right,
runway. So a lot of companies find that that's hard to sort of prove, like, oh, we need 1.8 million or 10 million or whatever that, right? You got to be able to justify that kind of investment. Well, then you need to be able to prove that you're going to deliver a certain type of return. So
right,
this is the challenge. Let's say you are you don't have the funding and you're bootstrapping. Well, then you kind of got to make it work with the team that you have. And that's
right,
where you use other incentives, like you give equity, you bring in co-founders or whatever. But those are the challenges. Those are the most common things that companies struggle with because they often underestimate how long it's going to take, how
right,
much money is going to be required. And then I see on the other end of the spectrum companies that fritter away the money that they have on the wrong things. So they might underestimate marketing expenses or spend their money on an offer or who knows
right,
what. But they get caught up, the ones that get the money in, they feel like they're flush, and
right,
maybe they overhire, or who
right.
knows. Lots of potential pitfalls are there when you have too much money.
Sure. And speaking of pitfalls and perhaps traps, one of the it seems to be one of the main sources of kind of that initial capital, I think especially with startups that are bootstrapping or kind of in that category, is family and friends.
Yeah.
My feeling is this: I would personally avoid that unless it was profitable and you could say verifiable. But and this isn't an indictment, towards startups. Everybody has a different situation and whatnot. But for me, I do feel that could be a slippery slope. Um,
Yeah.
and I wanted to know from your experience, like, what have you observed or seen from, let's say, startups who, let's say, their first go-to is, family and friends before, really articulating the proof of market and pitching to VCs or angel investors. For me, I'd feel like this. It'd actually be better to have a system where you actually kind of start pitching, or at least have some sort of action plan where your pitch is going to be appropriate and almost calibrated for the angel investors and VCs, because I think that's going to be like a good litmus test, so to say. Going straight to relatives, I think that could go one of two ways. Like I said, I think everybody's situation is different, but I just kind of wanted to know what you've seen or what you've experienced from clients and other scenarios dealing with that.
Listen, family relationships are fraught at best, right?
Right.
So
Exactly.
I wouldn't say never go to family,
Right.
because some family are incredibly supportive, maybe believe, okay, I want to invest in this idea, and if I lose the money, it's okay,
Sure.
right? If as long as you're able to have that conversation, like, dad, mom, Uncle Joe, you know, I would love you to invest in what I'm doing, but you need to know there's a risk here. You might lose all your money. Please don't give me your inheritance or your retirement funds,
Sure.
right? Like, but I don't think that conversation always happens, Um, and I also, uh, I, th- I think founders need to be prepared. Like, it's a huge responsibility to start a business and run a business. But then when you have the weight on your shoulders of paying other people back, or
Right.
running the risk of losing that, the money that they gave you, that's difficult. And it's, so, not that it's hard with any investors. I mean, the truth is, let's just quote that statistic again. 90% of startups fail. You got a
Right.
1 in 10 chance you're going to make it work. And even then, that means, is that a 7-year time horizon, 10 years, right? It's
Right.
not, this is the long game. If you really believe in your idea and you want to see it through to having an exit, right? That's
Right.
why, angel investors, they're typically investing in 8 to 12 different, um,
Right. Different
investments for
projects.
their
Yeah.
portfolio to be diversified, because they think one, maybe two are going to pay off. So,
Right.
I wouldn't say never go. Like, I think it's amazing for people, who have good relationships with their families. If, family members are supportive, can give them advice. But, I think part of it is, why do you want the money? Do you want the money to, like,
The why behind it. Yeah.
pay you be a salary, or do you want the money for other reasons? Like, the reason you go to angels, or even, venture capital, private equity, is you kind of want their expertise, you want their network, you want
Right.
their, their insights and their feedback. So to just go to people for money's sake, that's, if I were the family member, I'd be like, why are you coming to me? Like, I'm not the bank. You go to the
Sure.
bank when you want a loan, right? Right. So, I just think you need to be able to have an open and honest conversation about practically what you're trying to achieve, and whether they buy into it or not, and then whether they can help you. Because once someone gives you money, they kind of, you owe them,
Right.
right? So it's also hard to, have a no strings attached kind of arrangement. So, those are just all the things you want to think about before you go to the family.
Yeah, and I think what you said is very, very practical and realistic, actually. Uh, Very well said. And as far as kind of going off of that, what are some of the major red flags that you'll see? Let's say if you're taking on a client, slash startup, what are kind of the combination of red flags that you'll encounter where, this notion will come to mind? Okay, if they don't correct course right now, the shit's going to hit the fan for them. So if you can
Yeah.
kind of maybe talk about some of those kind of writings on the wall, so to say.
So, one of the biggest red flags for me is often around co-founders not being in alignment
Okay.
around a lot of things. So, they don't have a shared vision for the company. They haven't divided up responsibilities, so it's unclear what people's roles are. Um, Maybe they have a great idea, but they don't really understand the market or have a client focus, and a
Right.
segment that they're going after. So those are some of the biggest things that I see. a lot of the startups that I know, that I've worked with in the past that have not been successful, often the co-founders, one of them leaves. There's some conflict, or they're not invested in the business in the same way. And
Right.
sometimes they start out in alignment, but then over time they don't. I worked with some Bitcoin founders, like in the very early stages. They had they were starting an exchange, and they hadn't handled certain things well. So there was already this animosity that was carrying over, and it was impacting them.
Wow.
So that to me is one of the biggest red flags, is around the co-founders, the founding team, and sort of making sure you've got the right people on the same page around what you're doing. I almost want to say, to me, that's kind of like the biggest one. And then let's just say it's a solo founder and they're trying to move forward.
Right.
I think where they can be struggling is if they're not able to bring in the right expertise, and they're not able to execute, make decisions, realize what they don't know, and kind of get that initial MVP going.
Right. And speaking of expertise, you mentioned angel investors and you mentioned the solo co-founder. You know, um, is it ever a situation where you have to tell, let's say, a founder or a co-founder, listen, you don't know X, Y, and Z. You really need to look outside of your bubble right now. Like, are those type of conversations kind of like a little bit of an ego melee where you kind of have to, obviously in a productive, constructive way, but I can imagine it could be like almost like a landmine kind of conversation.
Yes, it can be. I have worked with co-founders. So I work with founders and companies, and I make that distinction. When I'm coaching the founders, it's usually around their leadership, their interpersonal skills, their decision making, right? So it's often about the co founders' relationships. I consider that a coaching relationship.
I see.
When I'm working with the organization, that's around the business strategy, the objectives, the team. It's right, it's helping the organization. So I have, so usually when I'm in the business context, people will listen to a business advisor pointing out, you're not aware of this, this, and this. And
Right.
they will either choose to listen to you, or they'll decide, you know what, I know better than you. I don't need you anymore. And then you're gone.
Sure.
So that's on the company side. And then on the founder side, what I've seen is this is where the ego can get in the way, and the founder thinks they know better. And so again, if it's the CEO and they're not open, then they're going to shut you down. That's just what happens. And unless you
Yeah.
find a way through, and sometimes you do. I've worked with co-founders where the other members of the team will point things out, and then let's say the CEO will be like, oh, okay, that's a good, and they come around.
Sure.
But sometimes they don't. And then you gotta, power struggle.
Wow.
So
Yeah, and that definitely makes a tremendous amount of sense to say the very least. And when kind of navigating, I guess you could say, those two contexts of, let's say, having to advise an organization, which I'd imagine kind of takes almost and correct me if I'm wrong, almost like a kind of a more broader approach. And it seems like startups, it's very fine tuned. It's almost a bit more, I guess you could say, almost magnified. You're dealing kind of closer especially when you're dealing with like, co-founders, and
Yeah.
things like that as, as well. So when it comes to, let's say, dealing in those two contexts, for you personally, which one do you find easier or at least more natural to navigate? Because I can imagine kind of both how I can imagine both contexts how, let's say, maybe sometimes dealing with an organization might actually be easier. They might actually have a bit more of a refined process and kind of more of a, not to say like a, let's say, like a hive mind, but more of kind of a broader awareness of itself as far as where it is in the market. And maybe the co-founder, or in, let's say, a startup company, that, let's say, that you could say self-awareness might not be there yet because they're new.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head about the issue regardless, which is how aware are the members of the team and how open are they to moving forward? So I don't think one or the other is easier. I think they're both, fun for me to work with and challenging.
Right.
So I've seen co-founders that are pretty aligned and can be great to work with because they get it.
Right.
And I've also seen organizations where, a leadership team seems to be on the same page, and then out of the blue, the CEO doesn't like something, shuts the whole process down.
Right.
So the organization was moving forward, and then the CEO is like, no, I want to go in this direction. So I've seen that happen a lot.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
frustrating. And listen, don't get me wrong. I'm not going to second guess. You got to respect people. They have a view. And if they're the leader and that's how they want to play it, power to you. You do
Right.
you. But that doesn't mean it's the right way to go. It doesn't mean you're going to have the support of your team to make it happen. And, it's on you. So,
Sure. Right.
like,
Absolutely. And speaking of, some of those issues. So one of the, I guess you could say, the main themes that's thrown around when it comes to startups is that everybody wears numerous hats, so to say.
yeah,
So, even though you have a co-founder team, let's say it's CEO, COO, CFO, everybody's also doing a lot of other functions that are really outside the scope of what they should be
yeah,
focusing on. Um, as kind of maybe playing devil's advocate here, could this whole wearing multiple hats thing, could that be a recipe for disaster where, let's say, boundaries and the scope of duties are just not clear? People are either stepping on each other's toes, people are burning themselves out, and
yeah,
I guess you could say it's harder to track
yeah,
and organize your work if you're doing too many things.
yeah. I think you're right. This is so, on the one hand, I don't think you have a choice. When you're
Right.
starting out,
In a
when you
practical
have a
reality,
few
yeah.
founders, people do need to wear a lot of hats. So I think that that's a given and it's inevitable. That being said, what I think doesn't happen often enough is the co-founders communicating from the very beginning around a number of different things. One, their goals for the company.
Right.
Two, their expectations. All right, I'm going to be in this for the next 3 to 5 years, or, I'll help you with this until I get a full-time gig that's going to, pay my retirement. Like, you
Right.
don't know what people want. So I think there's also, there has to be this frank conversation with what is it that each co-founder is bringing to the table that they're good at, so their
Right.
actual strengths, and then what do they want to do? And then let's say there's a conflict because you got two people who are pretty strong and this one wants to do it, right? Then you kind of have to agree. Can you share?
Right.
Because like, and I was just having this conversation recently. with a founder, and their co-founder was not in the conversation. And it was around, for example, media. So
Okay.
this person was more comfortable speaking to the media. They were getting a lot of the attention. The other founder was not, but so that was maybe creating a certain animosity, like who's
I
the
see what you
leader,
mean.
who should get
Right.
the credit, right? Again, ego, right? All coming back to ego.
Right.
But but there's a place for multiple members of a leadership team to speak to the media, because the person who's the CEO, they can speak about the vision. The person who's the CRO can talk about the client needs. The technologist can speak about the like, it doesn't need to be this thing where one person holds all the cards, right? So I think there isn't enough discussion about a decision making. Are we
Right.
going to do everything by unanimous consent, or are we going to divide and conquer and empower different
Right.
members of our team to make certain decisions independently? At what
Right.
point do they need to come back and get buy-in from the other members of the team so everyone's in agreement about moving forward? And that process and how that gets decided is actually really critical, because it's going to determine how quickly the company can move, and whether they're all moving in sync or whether they're kind of having struggle from the beginning.
Right. And you know what? You raise a lot of good points, and I kind of conceptualize some of what you said like this. And we'll get to the successful cases of startups and companies, a bit further in. But what I conceptualize based on what you said, and also some of the feedback I've had from other guests who come on the show, for the startups and let's say the companies that don't work out well, I feel like you almost run into almost two different type of, you could say, self-sabotaging, self-destructive models. I feel like on one hand, you have like the crazy Roman emperor model, where,
Yeah.
like you said, it seems like everybody's on the same page. And then for whatever reason, let's say the CEO comes out and undermines everything because
Yeah.
they felt a certain way later on, or they just decided to kind of unilaterally change their
Yeah.
mind about things. And then it
Yeah.
kind of causes a lot of disruption, the bad kind of
Yeah.
disruption. And then on the other hand, it seems like you almost have like you could say the oligarchy, where you have everybody who's in charge, but nobody's culpable or really responsible, so nothing kind of gets done, type of thing.
Yeah. 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 I've seen them both. I've seen them all. Look, I think they each have their own risks. When you have a dictator, unfortunately, it can actually be successful, right? Because
Right.
there's a decision maker who's calling the shots and moving things forward.
Right.
However, the downside of that is that you can't build an organization with one person. You
Right.
need a team. And if you're a dictator, people don't want to work for you. So it's kind of
Right.
hard to retain talent. And also, people don't feel that they can do their best work if they're being second guessed at every single turn.
Right.
I always tell the story. I worked with a CEO who would tell the tech team, would ask them, when will this new release be ready? And they'd say September. And he'd
Right.
say, great, I need it by June.
Right.
And they'd be like, okay, so then they'd deliver something in June. It would be crap, right? It would be full of bugs. And then it would take until September for them to fix all the bugs and for the product to be right. So
Right.
it was difficult. It was a difficult environment, because if you're a technologist and you're being asked what you think, and then you're being told to
Right.
right. So that's just one example. And then on the other extreme, where it's like decision by consensus, the challenge there is that you could just be debating for debate's sake on and on. It's like blah, blah,
Right.
blah. Like, ugh,
Right. It could be
that's
like
just not,
yeah, a congressional hearing, all talk and nothing seems to get done.
yeah. And I've seen that, right? So you need to find this place, this sweet spot where you have a certain amount of agility
Right.
because you're making decisions and agreeing, moving forward, checking in, testing, getting feedback, realigning, moving forward, checking it, right? It's like a process, nothing is set in stone, but you kind of want to make decisions so you actually can move forward. And
Right.
then you sort of see what's going to unfold, and then you can reassess and sort of adjust and pivot as needed. But you can't, oh my God, there's the expression, cluster frick, right? There's that,
Yeah. Right.
like, there
Right.
are so many other, there was another one I couldn't think of, but like, you don't want it to be out in, like, the jury to be in deliberation indefinitely. Like,
Right.
all right, you can have
Good way
your
of putting it.
coffee break, then come back, make a decision. Like,
Yeah.
let's move this forward, right? Because
Right.
otherwise you're going to miss the market. So that's one of the things, you know, you got other competitors. They're moving
Right.
ahead. Like, you want to be in the race. You don't want to be like
Yeah.
on the sidelines tying your shoelaces, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And if we're to talk about, let's say, the more successful examples, and obviously there's going to be problems in that, but one of the things I see, this is either through research and having guests on it, it seems like when a company, when they start having very positive, you could say forward momentum, things are going right, there tends to be almost like these little cultures of like sycophants and yes people that will usually surround the decision makers. This has been expanded upon across hundreds, if not thousands, of years of philosophy and literature. And it seems to me that a lot of times when companies end up turning sour, it seems like it's almost like this inner circle of, you could say, the yes men, the yes women kind of end up poisoning the leaders almost, and the leaders maybe, let's say, not understanding or at least being aware of that in the process. So, my question to you is: have you ever had to, let's say, speak to one of these decision makers and say, "Listen, if you don't deal with this individual or these group of individuals, this is going to create a toxic work culture. This is going to undermine your product or service. This is going to damage your reputation."
I haven't had a specific conversation like that, but I've had the conversations. What I've noticed is, you know, it's a little lonely at the top, right?
Right,
If you don't make room for people to engage with you and be open. So if you're the CEO and you say, I have an open door policy, or you can come to me, but then you shut people down, you don't listen to what they say, or you ignore their input, they're just not going to come to you.
right,
So I think that gets back to this theme of awareness, helping leaders to realize, are they engaging with enough members of the team to really have their pulse on what's happening within their organization? And startups, it's hard not to be in the loop, right? Because you got a
right,
few people. So let's say a startup is maybe 30 or fewer people. There is
right.
no reason why at a startup the CEO shouldn't know exactly what's going on with everything. So
Absolutely.
it's usually the bigger companies where this happens. But you know, on the one hand, having a team that you've worked with that supports you, that obviously can enable a leader to feel powerful and be more effective. I won't talk about any
Sure.
examples
Sure.
in recent political history. Um,
Right.
but at the same time, you strong leaders want talent working for them that are, I don't want to say smarter than them, but smart enough in the areas that they're owning to really advise them so that they can make the best decisions. I mean, you want to surround yourself with talent. If you're
Right.
only surrounding yourself with people pleasers, then you're really insecure, and you need to look at that, right? Like that's not
Sure.
helpful. So I've also seen the situation where teams do have toxic employees, and the founders don't want to deal with it because they don't want to be the bad guy or the meanie.
Right.
And so I did have a situation like that where it was pretty obvious there was like one person who was just incredibly difficult to work with, and nobody wanted to deal with this team member.
Right.
And where I went with the organization was to help them try to look at their values, right? Because that's where you have a context, right? You can say, we value collaboration, honesty, supporting customers. So then if somebody's out of line, you can say to them, here are the things that are important to us as a company. When you did this, you really weren't acting in alignment with the way we operate around here. So your behavior needs to change, or you're not going to be here much longer, because we can't operate like that. That's
Right.
not the way we do things here. So then it's not about the founder calling someone out. It's about creating this environment and culture that is supportive of a mission, so that everyone who's working together has a way of making sure they are working towards the same goals.
Right.
So that's one way I would approach that challenge.
Yeah, and I can imagine, especially going about and approaching those type of challenges. There's certainly a lot of I would imagine very tricky footwork involved, because relationships are complicated, and you know and especially I think within an organization or within a group of organizations, a sledgehammer approach might not in many cases be the best way to go about that. You may have to use a scalpel, or or a different type of tool,
Yeah.
in your tool chest, so to say. So I think that's definitely a great point you mentioned. And if you could list briefly, what are some of the, you could say, the more successful examples that you've seen, where whether it's a startup or whether it's an organization where you saw, let's say, the right combination, the right recipes of everything we've just talked about? If you
Yeah.
can kind of expand a little bit on it.
Yeah. So what I've seen is when you have a really great team of people and they're empowered and aligned around the goals of the organization, so everyone knows what they're working towards,
Right.
and they understand why they're doing it and what their role is, right? Then everyone can kind of work in the same way. And, you know, and then sometimes, look, it's inevitable, conflicts, differences of opinions arise. But if there are frameworks for how people can resolve their issues, like the product team needs something delivered by this date, the marketing team wants it by this date, the technology area doesn't have the resources. Well,
Right.
you kind of all have to get in a room and sort it out and come to an agreement in order to move forward. And if those people can't do it, then, maybe the CEO, the founders come in. So I think successful companies just sort of have this operating rhythm and this agreement around their goals and objectives, that they want to achieve the same things in the same way, so that
Right.
everyone can be successful. Like,
Right.
you're all in it, ideally for the same reason. So I think when there's politics that comes in and power structure, right, those are the things that undermine the team achieving the same goals, right? So it's really about finding folks who kind of can get behind the same objective and want to work together to achieve it. And then the leadership gets out of their way and lets them do it. And
Right.
and then amazing shit can happen, right? Like that's where I've seen companies be super successful, when they really like unlock their talent and let them run and make things really happen.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's very, very well said to say the least. And I think it's also nice to see when you do have those successful combinations of recipes, and you can see really a good brand, a good product, and a good service, arise from a lot of that as well. I think I think as a society we only benefit from having more and more successful startups and successful companies versus versus the opposite. And going from that, what would you say are some of the largest struggles? Let's say either as far as an organization or a startup, when you're taking on one as a client for the first time, you're getting a complex array of issues, problems, personalities. Um, how do you essentially take a step back and almost diagnose what's going on? Because for guests who watch this show, I know plenty of people who either currently or are about to go into essentially doing what you're doing, consulting and working with startups. So sometimes when you first take on that client, it can be a little daunting, I would imagine, especially at first. So do you have like a method or some sort of like inner compass where this is how you diagnose it and this is where to start, so I can do this effectively without being overwhelmed or getting lost in the weeds somewhere else?
Well, what I would say is I think everyone is going to approach this in a different and unique way depending on their backgrounds. My background is marketing, product management, leadership. So those are the areas that I tend to look at, and the culture. And I try and do an assessment before I even work with a client, if I understand what their challenges are, if they're interesting to me and I think I can help them solve the issue, and do I want to work with them. So I need to sort of do that assessment before I even go into work with a company. And then once I feel confident that I can help them solve their challenges, and they feel like I'm the one who can work with them to achieve their goals, then it usually goes pretty smoothly. But I spend a lot of time at the beginning really ensuring that I'm understanding what they're trying to achieve. I just had a conversation recently with a founder who had a specific challenge. So, for example, my expertise is B2B. I really work with organizations selling to other organizations. If someone comes to me with a B2B, a B2C, or a direct to consumer issue, or e-commerce, for example, I'm more than likely to say to them, that's not my expertise. It's not that I can't help you, but that's really not my sweet spot. I can help you with this, 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 and this. I can help you with your mission. I can help you with your messaging. I can help all of these things. But if you need a digital marketing strategy and SEO and Google Ads, I'm not the right person for you. You got to actually find the person with that skill set, but that's not me. So I think there's something about, for those who might be starting out, knowing what your real strengths are and what you're good at and how you can help clients, and ensuring that when you work with clients, you're playing to your strengths and they need the skills that you have, because otherwise it kind of can be tricky.
Right. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And do you feel like sometimes where, and I like how you put this, playing to your own strengths. Do you feel that there is a tendency, whether it's maybe people when they're first onboarding onto a company, they want to do everything, they want to make the best impression possible, and they take
Yeah.
on too much responsibility
Yeah.
for, let's say, their bandwidth, at that very moment?
Yeah. I think as they say, you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver,
Right.
because that is a recipe for disaster. So I do think many, I also coach a lot of emerging leaders around career transitions and growth opportunities around their professional development. And I do, and I actually, a lot of my clients are also business owners with their own consulting or coaching businesses. So I find that people often underestimate how long things are going to take, whether that's how long it takes to learn something new, how long it takes to deliver something. So, for example, I've launched over 100 products. I had, over 3 decades of experience bringing products to market. I usually have a pretty good sense of, well, this is how long it's going to take to develop something.
Right.
If someone says to me, oh, I can do that in, 3 weeks, I'll say, really? Help me understand. Do you have some new technology that I'm not
Right.
familiar
You have some
with?
sort of
Right. Like,
edge that nobody knows about
so,
right now.
and if they can prove it, I'm like, great, that's amazing. But
Right.
so I think you need to know what you know, and
Right.
also be aware of what you don't know, because those are the people that are, dangerous, or the ones who don't know what they don't know.
Right.
And right, like they need to be more aware of what they're getting into.
Right. Right. Very, very good points made. And one of the topics I wanted to touch on too is that, and this is a criticism that has existed for quite a while, but this is also criticism that has also entered the blockchain Web3 metaverse space, is essentially kind of like a culture of like a good old boys type of club, something from like the Web 1 and Web 2, you could say,
Yeah.
eras that hasn't really left. And essentially you have, and I'm obviously giving the Spark Notes version of this, where essentially you have the same type of people hiring the same type of people like themselves. So,
Yeah.
it seems this has really been a problem that has not either been effectively addressed, articulated, resolved. I kind of wanted to know some of your thoughts on that, because a lot of times, like, some of the things I'll hear, yeah, it's like a tech bro culture, things like that. And it's
Yeah.
kind of like
Yeah.
you have these companies and they're all kind of archetypes of things that you've already seen or experienced. They're almost like a TV type of
Yeah.
you could say like caricature, so
Yeah.
to say. So I kind of wanted to know what's some of your thoughts, on that.
Well, sadly, that's not only relegated to blockchain and Web
Right.
3.0. I think it happens in many industries that there's an old boys club. I
Right.
guess if we're being fair, maybe there are industries where it's an old girls club. I don't know. Or I tend to weigh in on the side of diversity, and not like diversity for diversity's sake,
Right.
like we need one of these and one of those and did it. No, it's that you want to have different perspectives,
Right.
and you want to have the best people with the best expertise to really inform the product that you're developing, right? So if you have too many people who are very similar in the way they think, in their orientation,
Too many
in
blind
how they
spots.
approach. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And so it's kind of hard to be innovative and to know that you're really bringing things to market in the best way possible if you're not really taking into consideration all of the different things. And unfortunately, this happens a lot, that people tend to want to work with people that they know because it's easy. So I understand it, but I think we need to guard against it, because, and I actually had an experience myself, having my own business, right? It makes it harder. And I remember I had an intern working for me, and I just didn't get along with this guy. Like we just were like totally different in how we thought. But ultimately, I learned so much from him because he really approached things in a really different way. And then when I was able to listen to his way of doing things, I was like, huh, that I don't think like that. I actually needed the insight that he had. It wasn't fun for me. It was actually pretty uncomfortable. And but ultimately I got a lot of value out of it. So I think it requires as leaders a shift in our mindset
Right.
and a willingness to be open to learning and really trying to get the best product that we can. And as long as there's an intention, if that's your desire to really create something great, then you want the best people to help you do that. And, you know, they may not be the same three guys you went to college with, right?
Right.
They might be different people.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great story too, about your intern. And I think it's always kind of better where, let's say if it's a little bit rocky at first, but you end up liking and respecting the person in the end, versus let's say you're working with or you're befriending someone who's very much like you, and then as kind of the journey, unfolds, you're kind of disappointed in the end, for
Yeah.
for one reason or the other.
Yes. Yeah. That happens a lot. And I can tell you, I've made that mistake too. I liked someone and I hired them. I mean, another intern, I remember, guy looked great on paper. It was the most fabulous resume I'd ever seen, really creative. And then I start working with this kid and I realized he didn't make the resume. He had someone else make it for him. It wasn't actually him. And who
Oh
he
wow.
was not reflected in, what I thought I was getting,
Right.
reading his resume. And it was a little tricky because, I knew his parents.
Oh
so,
yeah.
so that just goes to show you, you just don't know. Like, that's when you try to hire people, you want to hire for the skills they have that match the needs that you have. And then you want to look at those shared values. Are
Right.
you going to be able to work together? And those are the elements that that are important to moving forward.
Absolutely. Very, very well said. And on an ending note, if there's kind of like a maxim, or if there's some sort of guiding principle to anybody who's doing a startup, anybody who's, let's say, at the masthead, or anybody who's kind of at the spear tip of moving a great organization forward, if there's like a single, or maybe two-sentence type of bit of your own personal philosophy, what would you say to that type of audience? It seems to me, on the way to success, it seems like one of the most vulnerable times is when you're just about to reach that type of success. That seems like where things are actually the most fragile. Not necessarily when it's, you're on the cutting room floor and organizing things, and it's not like
Yeah.
when you're established. It's always like right at that kind of in between moment when you're about to make it.
Yeah. I'm sure I have many things to say because I obviously like to talk a lot. But
You and me both.
but the thing that's coming to my mind is I think it's important for leaders to know themselves. And by that, I mean, as we were speaking about previously, know what you're good at, know what you like to do, know what you don't know. And when you have that awareness, that openness, that willingness, you're going to be a better leader because you'll know when to bring in help, who to look for, how to get the input that you need, and you'll be aware of the areas where you actually do need support. But almost as important is you'll know how to trust yourself when you
Right.
do know what's right. So the more in tune you are with what's true for you, the more decisive you're going to be, the
Very
more
good point.
intuitive, the more connected to your team. I just think the leaders that really know what they do well and play to their strengths are the ones who are most successful, because you can bring in other people to help make up for the areas that you're not as strong as, and that can make you an even better leader.
Very well said. And I don't think I can per se add anything, to that. I think being capable and at least being very intuitive as to what you're good at, what you're not good at, when to ask for help. These are very, very important things. It almost seems like if you're the better one is at removing their ego from, let's say, or their
Yeah,
feelings from, let's say, the next steps of what they have to do. It sure as hell makes life a hell of a lot easier. And I'm very happy you came on to the show today. Often I have a lot of guests who come on, and most of the conversation is about blockchain and everything else related to it. But in life, there are certain fundamental recipes that make things succeed. This could be automobiles, this could be blockchain, this could be anything. And I think the articulation of those are very important, because it's very easy to kind of get you could almost say sucked into, or almost enamored with, like, all these great little things that are coming out and all these little great technologies that are coming out.
yeah,
But it's kind of like, if you don't know what to do with yourself
yeah,
in this type of environment, then how good is it going to be in the long run? So to say, if listen, if you can recite or program a smart contract, but you don't know how to deal with people, or you don't know how to
yeah,
essentially arrange the people or circumstances in your group in the right way,
yeah,
then it's kind of like you're ultimately limiting yourself, as time goes on. So, Lenore, I want to say thank you very much for coming on. I really had a great time with you. During the I guess during the previous virtual conference,
yeah. It's
about
been great
about
to talk with you, Adam. I really enjoy
likewise.
it.
And I hope you have an awesome weekend. Perhaps in a few months, I'd love for you to come back on, and perhaps we could,
Yeah,
certainly pick up from here, because 2022 is a very rocky year for both,
yeah,
for many reasons, both in tech in
yeah,
many ways. And I think we're going to see a lot of interesting trends and things come out over the next few months. I mean, a lot of nuanced, strange, complex things, and having experts being able to talk about that is very, very helpful, and enlightening, for the viewership, and just kind of the culture in general. How do we make things a bit better than they were yesterday? So yeah, again,
yeah.
Lenore, thank you
Well,
very much
I would
for.
love that. I would so enjoy talking with you. And I really think there are so many opportunities. And I'm so excited by all the leaders who are looking to do things better. And I want to support them to create, the best possible opportunities. So I know we talked about a lot of the pitfalls, but honestly, it can come together and be successful. And I think there are so many exciting opportunities to do things differently and better. So yeah, I'd love
Yeah,
to talk more.
awesome. Again, Lenore, thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to having you back on in a few months, and pick up from here, and see and really kind of almost troubleshoot. You could say the next wave, or the next array of trends that come up along this road. So I'm very much looking forward to that.
Sounds good.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you, and take care.